The night my husband said I was worthless is a moment I will never forget. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. The house was quiet, but the tension between us had been building for months. Then Dalton looked at me with cold eyes and pushed a stack of papers toward me. "Sign them," he said calmly. I looked down and saw they were divorce papers. My heart started beating fast. I asked him if he was serious, but he only laughed. He told me I had wasted 10 years of his life. He said I had no ambition, no talent, and no future. According to him, I had done nothing while he worked hard and built his career. He said he deserved someone smarter, someone successful, someone who could actually keep up with him. Then he said the words that hurt the most. "You're completely worthless without me," Dalton said. "You wouldn't survive a month on your own." I sat there quietly, listening to every word. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of him either. I simply looked at the papers on the table and realized something strange. Dalton believed he knew everything about me, but he didn't. What he didn't know was that for the past 3 years, while he thought I was doing nothing with my life, I had been working quietly on something of my own. Something he had never noticed. Something he never cared to ask about. And that small secret had slowly grown into a business worth $3 million. But Dalton had no idea about any of that yet. At that moment, he was completely confident that he was leaving a woman who had nothing. And I let him believe it. My name is Alara Wickham, and this is how the night my husband called me worthless became the beginning of the biggest mistake of his life. From the outside, our marriage probably looked perfect. Dalton Pierce was confident, successful, and very charming when he wanted to be. He worked as a financial consultant and loved talking about his career. People admired him because he always seemed sure of himself. Whenever we attended neighborhood gatherings or work events, Dalton was usually the center of attention. I was quieter. I preferred listening more than speaking. I handled most things at home, paying bills, organizing the house, cooking, and making sure everything ran smoothly. I also supported Dalton's career in every way I could. If he needed help preparing for meetings or wanted someone to listen while he practiced presentations, I was always there. In the early years of our marriage, I believed that was what partnership meant. But over time, things slowly started to change. Dalton began treating my opinions like they didn't matter. If I suggested something, he would roll his eyes or laugh like it was a joke. At first, I thought he was just stressed from work, so I tried not to take it personally. But the comments kept coming. If dinner wasn't perfect, he would say I had one job and couldn't even do that right. If I talked about learning something new or starting a small project, he would tell me I didn't understand how the real world worked. Sometimes he said these things in a joking tone, but the message was always clear. In Dalton's mind, I wasn't an equal partner. I was just someone who stayed home while he did all the important work. And the strange thing was that over time, I slowly started believing him. When someone repeats the same things to you for years, those words begin to settle into your mind. I stopped sharing my ideas. I stopped talking about my interests. It just felt easier to stay quiet. To everyone else, we still looked like a happy couple with a stable life. But inside our home, something was quietly breaking. And Dalton had no idea that the moment he laughed at me in front of other people would become the turning point of everything. A few months later, Dalton invited me to a dinner with some of his coworkers. It was at a large house owned by one of his senior colleagues. The evening looked formal but relaxed. People were talking about work, investments, and new opportunities. I mostly listened while Dalton spoke confidently about the market and his recent projects. Everyone seemed impressed by him, just like always. At one point, the conversation shifted towards small businesses and side ventures. One of Dalton's coworkers mentioned how his wife had recently started selling handmade furniture online, and it was doing well. Someone then looked at me and asked, "Alara, have you ever thought about starting something of your own?" For a moment, I hesitated. I usually stayed quiet during these conversations, but something inside me pushed me to speak. I said that I had been thinking about a simple home organization product that could help people save space in small apartments. I explained the idea briefly. It wasn't complicated, but it was practical, and I had been thinking about it for a while. Before I could finish, Dalton suddenly laughed. Not a small laugh either. It was loud enough that everyone at the table looked at him. A business idea, he said, shaking his head. Ilara couldn't even run a lemonade stand. The table went silent for a second. A few people forced small laughs because they didn't know how to react. Someone quickly changed the subject, but the damage was already done. I felt my face grow warm, and I kept my eyes on my plate for the rest of the evening. Dalton continued talking and joking like nothing had happened. But that moment stayed with me long after we got home. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the realization that Dalton truly believed I was incapable of doing anything meaningful. And strangely, that moment didn't destroy my confidence. It quietly started rebuilding it. After that dinner, something inside me changed. I didn't argue with Dalton about what happened. I didn't bring it up again either. On the outside, everything stayed the same. I still handled the house, cooked meals, and listened when he talked about his work. But at night, when Dalton was asleep or traveling for business, I started doing something different. I began researching the idea I had mentioned at the dinner. At first, it was just curiosity. I read articles about small businesses and watched videos explaining how simple products were designed and manufactured. I learned about suppliers, packaging, and shipping. The more I read, the more I realized that starting something small wasn't impossible. It just required patience and planning. Around that time, I remembered a small inheritance my grandmother had left me a few years earlier. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to start a small project if I used it carefully. So I decided to try. Quietly, I registered a small company under a private name and opened a separate business account. I didn't tell Dalton about any of it. Not because I wanted to hide things, but because I already knew how he would react. He would laugh. And I didn't want to hear that again. Instead, I worked slowly and carefully. I sketched designs for the home organization product I had imagined. I contacted a few small manufacturers and asked questions. Some of them ignored me, but one supplier responded and seemed willing to help. For the first time in years, I felt excited about something that belonged only to me. Every small step felt like progress. Dalton still believed I spent my days doing nothing important, and I let him believe that. Because the less attention he paid to me, the easier it was to keep building something he never expected. The first year was slow. My product was simple, but turning an idea into something real took time. I worked with a supplier to create a small batch of samples. Some of them had problems, so I had to adjust the design again and again. There were moments when I wondered if Dalton had been right about me. But each time I fixed a small problem, my confidence grew. Eventually, the first real shipment of products arrived at a small storage space I had rented quietly across town. When I saw the boxes stacked there, I felt proud and nervous at the same time. Now the real challenge began, selling them. I started reaching out to small home goods stores and independent retailers. Many of them ignored my emails or said they weren't interested. But a few store owners were curious about the design and agreed to test a small order. Those first sales felt incredible. They weren't huge amounts of money, but they proved that people actually wanted the product. Over the next 2 years, things slowly started growing. More stores placed orders. Some retailers recommended the product to other buyers. I improved the design, made the packaging better, and negotiated better prices with the manufacturer. Little by little, the business became profitable. Meanwhile, Dalton never noticed anything. He was often traveling for work or busy talking about his own achievements. As long as the house was clean and dinner was ready, he assumed everything else in my life was the same as it had always been. But behind the scenes, things were changing. By the end of the 3rd year, my company was no longer small. The revenue had grown steadily, and a business consultant I worked with estimated the company's value at around $2-3 million. And Dalton still believed I had done nothing with my life. By the time my business had grown into something stable, my marriage was already falling apart. Dalton had become more distant over the years. He spent more time traveling, more time on his phone, and less time talking to me. When we did talk, most of the conversation was about his work and how demanding his career had become. One evening, he came home later than usual. His expression was calm, almost cold, like he had already made an important decision. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where we had shared so many dinners before. Then he placed a folder in front of me. "I think we both know this marriage isn't working anymore," Dalton said. Inside the folder were divorce papers. He spoke as if everything was already settled. He said we had grown apart, and that staying together no longer made sense for him. According to him, he had carried the entire relationship for years while I contributed nothing meaningful. Then he said something that sounded less like honesty and more like arrogance. "You'll probably struggle after this," he told me. "Living on your own isn't easy when you've never built anything for yourself." He explained that I would receive a small settlement, but nothing close to the lifestyle we had during the marriage. He seemed completely certain that my life after the divorce would be difficult. I listened quietly while he talked. There was no anger in his voice. In fact, he sounded almost confident, like he believed he was doing the reasonable thing. When he finished speaking, he pushed a pen across the table. I looked at the papers for a moment, then calmly signed them. Dalton seemed surprised that I didn't argue or ask questions. But the truth was simple. He believed he was walking away from someone who had nothing. And I was perfectly fine letting him believe that, at least for a little while longer. A few weeks after I signed the divorce papers, the legal process officially began. Lawyers from both sides started organizing documents and reviewing financial information. Dalton looked completely relaxed during this time. To him, everything seemed simple. He believed the financial review would prove what he had always said, that I had nothing of my own. One afternoon, we were sitting in a conference room at a law office. Dalton was talking casually with his lawyer while mine reviewed a stack of documents. The atmosphere was calm, almost routine. Then Dalton's lawyer asked for the financial disclosures from both sides. My lawyer quietly placed a folder on the table. Dalton didn't even look at it at first. He leaned back in his chair like this meeting was just another small step before the divorce was finalized. But after a moment, his lawyer opened the folder and started reading. The room suddenly became very quiet. Dalton noticed the change in his lawyer's expression and leaned forward. "What is it?" he asked. His lawyer slowly turned the papers so Dalton could see them. There it was in clear writing. Founder and sole owner, Alara Whitcomb. Below that were the financial details of my company. Revenue reports, contracts, business valuation documents. At the bottom of one page was the estimated value of the company. $3 million. Dalton stared at the documents for several seconds without speaking. Then he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. This can't be right," he said. But the numbers were real. The company he never noticed, the work he never believed I could do, had quietly become worth millions. And for the first time since I had known him, Dalton Pierce had absolutely nothing to say. After that meeting, Dalton was not the same person anymore. The confidence he had shown during the divorce process slowly disappeared. Instead of acting cold and distant, he suddenly started speaking to me in a much softer tone. A few days later, he asked if we could meet and talk privately. We met at a quiet cafe in town. Dalton arrived earlier than me and was already sitting at a table when I walked in. He looked nervous, which was something I had never seen before. When I sat down, he tried to smile. "Alara, I think maybe we rushed into this divorce," he said carefully. I didn't respond right away. I simply waited for him to continue. Dalton began explaining that relationships go through difficult phases and that maybe we had both made mistakes. He said that after thinking about everything, he realized our marriage still had value. Then he suggested something unexpected. "Maybe we should stop the divorce process and try again," he said. His voice sounded calm, but I could tell he was choosing every word very carefully. He even started talking about how impressed he was by what I had built. He said he had always known I had potential, even if he hadn't expressed it properly before. Listening to him felt strange. For years, Dalton had spoken to me like I was incapable of doing anything meaningful. Now he was suddenly respectful and supportive. But the truth was obvious. The only thing that had changed was the number he saw in those financial documents. For the first time in our entire marriage, Dalton wasn't looking down on me. He was looking at what I had created. And suddenly, he didn't want to walk away anymore. A few days after our meeting at the cafe, Dalton asked if we could meet again. This time it was at the lawyer's office to discuss the final steps of the divorce. When I arrived, Dalton was already there. He looked calmer than before, but I could still see the tension in his face. His lawyer sat beside him, quietly organizing the paperwork. Dalton tried to start a conversation before the meeting officially began. "Alara, I've been thinking a lot about everything," he said. "Maybe I didn't handle things the right way before." I listened, but didn't interrupt. He continued speaking, saying that people make mistakes and that maybe we both had misunderstood each other over the years. According to him, the divorce had happened too quickly, and maybe we should reconsider our decision. Then he said something that sounded very different from the man I had lived with for 10 years. "I always believed you had potential," Dalton said. "I just didn't realize how far you had taken things." For a moment I almost laughed, because I remembered something very clearly. I remembered the dinner party, where he said I couldn't even run a lemonade stand. I remembered the many times he dismissed my ideas without even listening. And most of all, I remembered the night he pushed those divorce papers toward me and called me worthless. So I calmly reminded him, "You didn't believe in my potential," I said. "You believed I had none." Dalton didn't answer. The room stayed silent for several seconds. Then I signed the final documents confirming the divorce. Dalton watched quietly as the papers were completed. And in that moment, he realized something important. The success he suddenly admired was never something he helped build. It was something he had tried to walk away from. About a year after the divorce, my life looked very different. The business continued growing faster than I expected. More retailers began ordering the product, and new partnerships opened doors in other states. What started as a small idea in a quiet room had turned into a company with a strong reputation. I hired a small team to help manage operations, and for the first time, I wasn't doing everything alone anymore. The company that Dalton once would have laughed at had become a stable and successful business. Eventually, I decided to move. I bought a peaceful home near the coast, far from the neighborhood where Dalton and I used to live. The ocean air, the quiet mornings, and the slower pace of life felt like a completely new beginning. For the first time in many years, I felt calm. Not because of the money or the success, but because I had proven something to myself. I had built something real. Sometimes I would remember the night Dalton pushed those divorce papers across the kitchen table. I could still hear his voice saying I wouldn't survive on my own. Back then, he was absolutely certain about how my life would turn out. But life doesn't always follow the story people expect. The person he believed had no future was the one who quietly created a business worth millions. And the man who thought he was walking away from someone insignificant eventually realized he had walked away from something far more valuable than he understood. In the end, the divorce didn't destroy my life. It revealed the strength I had been building all along.